Welcome in. Mark Childress in for Mark Sturgis here on a Friday. We've got some special guests in studio. I'm about to tell you who they are. In studio with me, we're going to have a great show today, jam-packed with guests, and I've got some guest hosts in studio from ESPN, Kaila Burns-Heffner, content associate. I've got that right?
You got it right.
Excellent. It's always good to see you, Kaila. Thanks so much for coming in. Richmond Weaver from the nationally syndicated podcast, Rich Take on Sports. Hey, folks, we are going to have open phones here for the first part of the show, 844-477-3776. If you want to get in, talk about the new Clemson football schedule this week. We're about to talk about quarterback transfers in college football. So, Kaila, I'm going to start with you. I personally do not think all the transferring and playing immediately, even the grad transfer I think I'm okay with, but I'm really worried with all these lawyers involved and they're petitioning to be able to leave one school and play immediately in another school, even if they're not a grad transfer yet. I just feel like we're getting 2-3 years away from absolute chaos in college football. Am I right or am I wrong?
I think that's a fair point to make, for sure. I do believe that with how many different rules kind of surround the, different opportunities for people to transfer and when they can play, makes things a little bit complicated, brings in some legal battles. But I also think that allowing players, especially allowing quarterbacks, to transfer from places where they may be sitting behind some really good talent makes the sport of football better overall. I think it elevates the level of talent that teams are playing to if you take guys that are, could start right away as a true freshman that are sitting behind some, veteran guys and let them play at another team. I think that makes the sport of football better.
I've never looked at it that way. I think that's a really good point. Okay, so Kaila, where do you sit? So you made a good point that it's better for college football. Instead of having Jalen Hurts sitting behind Tua and playing in trash time, he gets to play next year, every game. That is good for college football. That's a great point. Haven't heard that one made before. Where do you stand on this? I mean, do you think it gets out of control in a couple of years, or is that guy Richmond right, which would surprise me? But maybe he is.
I side with Richmond on this one. I'm sorry, but
okay.
the way I've always kind of looked at it is like, say you go to a school on an academic scholarship, and that program may not pan out to what exactly you want it to pan out to for yourself and what you see yourself being successful in. No one's saying you can't leave and go to another school and accept money from another school to pursue your academic career there and advance to, whatever job path you want. So why are we so angry at some of these student athletes that are taking the opportunity and transferring wherever? I do see your point on yes, it might open the doors for some kind of sketchy recruiting situations at games down the road, but I don't really see it advancing to a point where it harms the sport.
Would it be better to go somewhere and play and then come to Clemson?
You could look at it from a player development situation too. If he's sitting there, granted the fact that there's always the risk of injury, so he could have a season-ending injury at Georgia Tech or say whatever team he's at, and then that kind of screws up his little life plan. But you can say that getting on-field experience is in game time action is definitely the most experience that he can really get.
The second those transfer rules drop, but I really feel like teams like Clemson would, I'm going to recruit to Clemson, and you're talking about having a bench. I got all these bench guys I'm going to spread out to some other places where I know they'll get the experience, and I'm just going to go grab who I want. You go down there and show out at Georgia Tech, Jimmy Green Beans, you can come up and play for me next year.
But also, if you look at the teams that have been doing the best in college football over the last few years, Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, Ohio State, there are also teams that are all losing their quarterbacks.
Yes.
There are also teams that, you look at Clemson. Clemson lost an absurd amount of quarterbacks when Trevor Lawrence came to town. 4,
Everybody transferred.
Yeah. So, they're not only on one end of the spectrum on that. They're also losing, players that can back up.
Yeah, they're not only becoming the richer, but that's what's going to happen.
Yep.
The rich are still going to be the rich.
Again, I know you think I'm wrong, Kaila, so what do you think?
I just still think that you should give just look at it the same way that you look at somebody who's trying to advance their career. They're going to put themselves in the best spot to advance their career. If you're putting an athlete in a spot where his coach leaves or he's not getting the playing time that he deserves or he thinks he deserves, let him choose the path that he wants to choose to get him to where he wants to go in life.
Now, I know Richmond argued this point. I can't remember if you took the same side with him or not, but if you did, Richmond said that there's no way. He just doesn't fathom why a kid would want to transfer mid-season. Explain to me why they wouldn't. Why wouldn't somebody, you would say why would they want to get lawyers so they could decide, so they could get out of their obligation and go anywhere and play right now? Why wouldn't they want to transfer midseason?
Oh, don't put that on me.
Yeah, well,
I'm not saying that I would be for midseason transfers because I think that's when things get really messy. I think people should be, with a team for the season and then not have a restriction on like waiting out any extra time. So like say, they sign up for the season and things aren't going the way that they want. I think it would get absolutely crazy if everyone's just like leaving because they didn't, play for the first 3 games or something like that and they're a true freshman. That could be a little bit dicey. But if you let them, stay out for the season, but then say, like, there's going to be no restriction for you to, like, be able to go to another school and play right away the next season, then I think that would be okay. But midseason, that gets
But
dicey.
that's the natural progression. Don Munson, voice of Clemson football and basketball. Don, always a pleasure to talk to you. A really big win for the Clemson Tiger basketball team on Wednesday night.
Oh no, a must win for that basketball team. To be perfectly honest with you, I think they have been pushed into a little bit of a corner, starting out 0-3, and 0-3 in this league is obviously is difficult to overcome. But the schedule is so front loaded for Clemson in these first 6 games in the league that was one that they needed to have, and so now you got back-to-back road games at Florida State, at NC State coming up this week, and you got to figure out a way to see if you can't steal one of these on the road.
Don, what do you think the key for this basketball team is now that they've gotten 1 win under their belt? What do you think the key for them is to keep that momentum up going into the rest of the ACC play?
Well, I think what we saw against Tech was the same formula that they used last year to win games. One, they've got to protect the ball. Can't turn the ball over. Clemson had been turning the ball over way too much. I mean, just way too much early on in the season. We saw them with, at times, 18, 19, 20 turnovers or more. And that's just not Brad Brownell's kind of club. I mean, you just can't do that. And the other thing is that, and this is everywhere in college basketball, you've got to have the ability to hit the three. You just have to have that ability. And it was good to see Scar. He had 3 threes in the game. It was good to see Marquise drilling them. Of course, he had a career-high 30 against Georgia Tech. But you've got to have that ability to show the ability to hit that 3 ball because it is such a big, big part of the collegiate game.
Don, earlier in the week, the 2019 Clemson football schedule comes out. What are your initial thoughts on the schedule?
None of us should be surprised what the schedule is because I think everybody already knew what the teams were coming in. It was just, what is the layout of all this is going to be? So I think we're going to find out quite a bit about Clemson football in 2019 in those first 3 games.
So aside from those 3 games to lead off the season, which 2 of those teams were the only 2 teams on Clemson's schedule to end up ranked in the top AP 25 last season, what do you think poses a challenge for Clemson the remainder of the season?
Oh, every game, Kaila, is a challenge. But people that overlook games are just absolutely kidding themselves. I mean, they're just absolutely kidding. And I know that people don't want to hear it, but it is a week to week grind because anybody can beat you any place, anywhere, anytime. We've seen that happen. Just because Clemson went 15-0 this season, already. You hear the fan base, we're going 15-0 again and winning back. Well, that's a whole lot easier said than it is done. I mean, it's incredibly hard to win football games. So just kind of knock it out one at a time. I do like the fact that Clemson has basically 3 open Saturdays. So I think that open Saturday that falls in October and certainly the one that falls before the South Carolina game, I think are very beneficial to Clemson. But it is a 1 week at a time windshield mentality. What is right in front of you, that's all that you can worry about. And I realize that media folks don't want to think that way. Or I realize that fan bases don't want to think that way. I, as a broadcaster, don't want to think that way. But that is, as Walter Cronkite said, that's the way it is. I mean, that is just the way it is.
So what you've seen from this team and being so close to the program, especially this year, there's a lot of talk about, maybe this is the best team ever. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I understand all the talk. I mean, it's obviously the first team in the modern era that's gone 15-0. The first time in a playoff era that the team has gone 15-0. But I think that's still to be determined. To be perfectly honest with you, I think that time helps determine that factor a little bit to say what is the greatest team ever. But again, that was part of the selling point that Coach Swinney was selling to his guys in the fact that, hey, here's, you get to play an undefeated Notre Dame, you get to play an undefeated Alabama. You can be the guys that for the first time ever can go 15-0 and all of that kind of stuff. You can go down in the history books as part of all of that. But I still think that we're a ways from really determining if this is the greatest team of all time. It's funny because the narrative certainly was going in that Alabama, had they won the way that Clemson won, there's no doubt that everything, this is the greatest team of all time. And obviously Clemson proved that to be not true. They absolutely proved that to be not true.
So, Don, I'm sure you could have probably a lot of different answers to this question with just how incredible this season has been for Clemson football and the record books that they've been able to, put their name next to. But what was your favorite moment from this past season?
I'm sitting here. I've got to write an article here coming up about just that, and I've been trying to determine what that is. And I'm probably the most memorable moment was Chase Bryce's pass on fourth down to Higgins that kept that drive alive against Syracuse, and then of course ETN winning it with a run with about a minute to go. So that whole drive and the way that whole drive came together, I think they went 92 yards. But they had to have that fourth down play from the arm of Chase Bryce. So if you're asking me for just one play and one seminal thing, that would be it. But obviously the moment of Santa Clara and the way that 3.5 hours played out, and just so doggone happy for the guys that came back, for the Christian Wilkins, the Cleveland Furls, the Austin Bryants of the world, the guys that came back, because they came back for that moment in time, and to see them be able to play in that moment, accomplish in that moment, and come away with a second national championship, I think, for all Clemson fans should be very, very special.
Welcome back in. Mark Childress for Mark Sturgis, Kaila Burns-Heffner from ESPN, and with me as well. Where should you place your bets this weekend? Who should you be betting on? We've got Blackjack Fletcher, analyst for the Action Network, co-host of the Favorites podcast. Blackjack, it looks like we might have lost him here. We'll get him back on the line. I'm curious to ask him about, to me, this is the biggest weekend of the year if you're a football fan. And I'm a big fan of, divisional weekend last weekend as well, Kaila. 4 games last weekend, 2 games this weekend. I mean, I love the Super Bowl, and you're always going to watch it, but there's just so much hoopla. The game lasts so long. There's usually a halftime guest that I'm completely uninterested in, I guess, because I'm old. But, it's to me, this is the biggest weekend of the year. This would be my can't-miss weekend, not the Super Bowl. How do you feel about that?
For sure. I mean, I think it's more fun when you have more games to watch, I mean, everyone's going to watch the Super Bowl regardless. People who aren't even sports fans are still going to watch the Super Bowl as a, activity. But when you have more games to watch and you're a sports fan, that's always going to get you more excited.
Where are you looking, if you were going to be taking your money, your hard-earned money, and putting it down, over on the AFC side, where would you be placing your bet in that game?
Look, I'm not a big bettor, and I really, really, really never want to bet against Tom Brady, ever.
Yes. Yeah, smart.
Ever. If you ask me my pick on that, I'm probably going to go with Kansas City. We can probably talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah.
But if you're asking me to put money on something, I'm never going to go against Tom Brady in the championship setting. Let's
go to the phones now. Blackjack Fletcher, analyst for the Action Network, co-host of the Favorites podcast. Blackjack, we were just talking, Kaila and I, a second ago. Is this your favorite weekend of the year when you've got championship weekend and the 2 games, or do you prefer Super Bowl weekend?
Well, guys, first, it's great to be with you live here on ESPN. But, yes, this is absolutely my favorite weekend. The Super Bowl, it's hit or miss, right? Sometimes we get a great game. Sometimes we get a game that's a stinker. But this weekend, we've got the 4 best teams in football going up against each other. And this has been one of those years where you could see this coming months away.
So what's your advice for, people going into this weekend, where they should put their bets on or what they should be thinking about?
Well, Kaila, I mean, it just kind of depends on what you're looking at here. If you're looking to bet on these games in terms of the side, I myself in the NFC, I'm looking at the Saints. I think they've been the most well-rounded, most complete team in football all season long. And there's 2 things that really are important to me coming into this game. The first one, last week, we saw the Eagles jump on them 14-0, and the Saints felt like they were in a bad hole there. And then that defense pitched a shutout for 3.5 quarters. And that was really impressive to me because it showed that they were able to step up and they were able to stop the Eagles and buy their offense time to find their rhythm and really get them back on track. The second thing is you cannot overstate how important that home field is for the Saints. The Superdome is an incredible atmosphere to go in. It's so hard, not only for the quarterbacks to make adjustments at the line, but for the offensive linemen to call protections and things like that. It's such an advantage for the Saints. The Rams, I don't think, have really faced anything like that except for when they went into the Superdome and lost by 10. So I lean to the Saints -3 in that game. On the AFC side of things, I think we're in for basically a repeat of the first game these two teams played. I think we're going to see a lot of points. I'm not worried about the cold weather. The cold generally doesn't affect offenses. It's just wind, statistically, is the variable to look at, and there's not supposed to be a ton of that at Arrowhead. The Patriots, to me, just don't have the offense to keep up with Kansas City. And I think what will happen is you'll see that Chiefs defense, they played a lot better against the Colts. They tend to play better at home. And one key factor that was missing in their first matchup was Justin Houston. He wasn't playing for Kansas City. With him and Dee Ford, the pass rush for the Chiefs is pretty solid, and I think they'll do enough to disrupt Brady, who's only 1-2 career in Arrowhead. I think that they do enough to get the win there. I'm on the Chiefs as well, -3.
We're talking with Blackjack Fletcher here, an analyst for the Action Network. Blackjack, I saw earlier on the Action Network that you had bet on New Orleans to win the Super Bowl back in August. It's a pretty big bet to place back in, the preseason. Now looks like it's suiting like it might happen for you.
Kayla, it was one of those things that was actually kind of spontaneous. I was spending a lot of time out in Las Vegas over the summer, and people were very, very high in the preseason on the San Francisco 49ers, and I was not. And a lot of people, even at the Action Network, were very high on the Niners, and it got to the point where it just kind of made me mad talking about it because I didn't think there was any way that team had enough talent. And I remember being in Caesars and looking at the odds board on NFL futures, and the Niners were, I think, at 18-1, and the Saints were at 22-1. And I just said to myself, there's no way the New Orleans Saints, who were one game away from the NFC Championship game last year, should be at lower odds than the Niners. So, you go and you plunk down $100 on them at 22-1. So, I'm pulling for the Saints here.
So how much, I know we talked a little bit about, Justin Houston being missing for Kansas City earlier in the season, and now, Aqib Talib was missing, and he's a huge part of the Rams defense. How much does that affect when you get these defensive guys back into the mix? How much does that affect it going into the weekend?
The Houston addition matters a lot more to me than the Talib one does. And that's just because Aqib Talib is an excellent corner, and he's going to be following Michael Thomas around. And I expect him to make life difficult for Michael Thomas. But look, he's not going to shut him out. Aqib Talib isn't that kind of corner at this point in his career. So Michael Thomas is still going to get something out of that. And the Saints, I think, just with the way the Rams play defense, I expect them to use Kamara and Ingram more this week than they did last week. So I don't think it's as much of a hindrance as Justin Houston will be to the Patriots. Because, listen, everybody who's watched Patriots football has said this for the last decade. The only way to really beat the Patriots is to hit Tom Brady. You have to make him uncomfortable in the pocket. And Justin Houston and Dee Ford, you can't double-team both of them. So those are guys that can get home and put that pressure on Brady and really make his life difficult.
Let's go to the phones. He covers the Panthers for the Charlotte Observer, Marcel Louis-Jacques.
Panthers owner David Tepper had a meeting earlier, and a very few amount of people were able to be in that room with him to hear what he's saying. And I know that you were one of the reporters who was able to sit in on that. What are some of your takeaways from what he had to say about this season?
Well, Kayla, I think the biggest takeaway is what's been driving the national news over the past couple days, and that's the notion that David Tepper suggested Cam Newton could sit out the 2019 season, which we can get into a little later, but that's not exactly what he said. What's not being talked about, though, are the elephants that I think David Tepper addressed on both sides of the ball. throughout the season, we could tell that some of the weaker points on the team were their offensive line and their pass rush. And David straight up said the offensive line looked like a disaster. That's an exact quote. And he also admitted that the defense maybe got older a lot faster than a lot of people expected. So I think it kind of confirmed what we've been guessing over the past couple months, what we've been speculating, that those are two positions the Panthers are going to target heavily come free agency and come the NFL draft.
So we'll talk about the, upcoming few weekends in the NFL a little bit later on. But first of all, the Panthers aren't participating in those weekends for the championship and the Super Bowl, but they are, busy trying to figure out what they're going to do with the offseason and what they're going to do with the draft. Can you tell us a little bit on what you think the Panthers are going to do this offseason and, where they're looking for into this 2019 draft?
Yeah, well, Kaila, I think the three biggest needs, two of them are what I mentioned earlier, the offensive line and their pass rush. They also need to shore their secondary up. They need to build depth in that secondary, because you saw it against Seattle when Dante Jackson was knocked out of the game and Corn Elder was thrown in there. Russell Wilson tore them apart. They don't really have that. They don't have that depth back there. And not to mention at safety, they've got their two starters both needing new deals this offseason. But luckily for them, I think at safety, that's a position you can address in free agency. I think you can re-sign Eric Reed, who was one of the better safeties in the NFL from a football standpoint, beyond what you think about him off the field. I think you can sign him. You can sign a guy like Clinton-Dix, and all of a sudden that solidifies your secondary, and that becomes a strong point of this defense with Jackson and with James Bradbury at cornerback. Through the draft, I think picking at 16, you should be able to get a guy like Oklahoma's Cody Ford. He's their starting tackle. He's a guy who can rotate outside and inside of the line, so he doesn't have to play right away, but he's a guy who can add some depth to you at multiple positions. And I think you can address defensive end in the pass rush in the second round. Maybe a guy like Clemson's Austin Bryant. Kayla, I know you're pretty familiar with him, but he doesn't get the shine that the Cleveland Farrells, Christian Wilkins, and Dexter Lawrences of the world get, but he's just as talented, and he'd probably be a focal point of any protection scheme where he's on almost any other line in the country. So I think those are three positions that they need to address immediately. And beyond that, they can look at depth at linebacker. They can look at a big-bodied wide receiver and a red zone target. They can look at a tandem running back. I think, Christian McCaffrey was excellent this season, but there has to be some concern about his longevity given his usage rate. I mean, the guy he went 5 straight games this year without leaving the field on offense. And as effective as he can be, you're going to want to give him a guy who can spell him, or who can spell with, like what New Orleans does with Mark Ingram and with Alvin Kamara.
So we've had some people on here predicting, even in the preseason, that the Saints would go all the way. Do you agree with that, or who do you think is going to be winning the Super Bowl this year?
Yeah, I heard that. Blackjack, he took New Orleans at 22-1 odds, and there were worse odds than San Francisco. And that blows my mind as well. I did not know that. But, yeah, I think that New Orleans is absolutely a team that can go all the way. I think that they're the most balanced team as far as offense and defense goes, remaining in the playoffs. That's one of, if not the best run defenses in the NFL. So it's going to force people to become one-dimensional, and that's big. That's big this time of the year. So I would, if I had to pick one team, the Chiefs are a really attractive option just because of what Mahomes can do with the football. But my heart, my gut is telling me that New Orleans goes all the way. And Panthers fans listening to it, I know that's got to taste like vinegar, but facts are facts here.
Drew Brees has had an incredible season, but for Patrick Mahomes' first season to have some of these numbers that match up almost evenly historically with Tom Brady's best seasons ever, he's the MVP, right?
I mean, I would think so, but are you going to give Patrick Mahomes the MVP if Brady comes back and wins?
I don't know. I think, and this is why it's good that the MVP is given later in the season, not before the bowl games and the playoffs. Hello, college football and Heisman Trophy. I think if the Chiefs were to advance and the Saints were to drop out or vice versa, I think that, to your point, I think that's who's going to win the MVP based on who goes farther. Yeah?
Yeah. Well, I think the craziest thing about this is that, there's an 18-year difference, age difference in between these two quarterbacks. And we're comparing them as it's the old vet and the rookie, but their numbers are it's just insane what Patrick Mahomes has been able to do with 19 career games that he started this season.
Yeah, it's amazing, and you got to love the guy, man. Riverboat gambler, throw it from anywhere on the field to anywhere on the field, and again, numbers don't lie. There's a lot of really great stuff going on right there. Kaila, we were talking during the break. You went to the Hornets game last night, so tell me a little bit about that.
So Hornets-Kings game, I went last night. It was
the Kings are playing great. That's a good team right now.
Yeah, well, the Hornets won. They came out with the win last night. Actually, pretty decisive win, too. So I was hoping for a closer basketball game. I love when it goes down to the wire, but it was a fun game to watch for sure. It's my second Hornets game ever, so I'm still kind of relatively new to the Charlotte area, so I'm trying to get into welcoming in on all the Charlotte sports, but I'm a Baltimore sports fan at heart, so
yeah. No Baltimore basketball team.
There's no Baltimore
basketball
team, so
maybe one day.
Fandom is in free agency, as I like to call it, for the NBA.
Yeah, you need to do one of those social media things where you shop your fandom. Have you seen those before?
Shop my fandom.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm gonna end up with people being like, "Oh, be a Lakers fan," and I just don't want to join a bandwagon team. I'd never join as good as they are, Golden State Warriors. I could never join their team.
Yep.
Because that would just be a bandwagon. Now LeBron's with the Lakers, so I can't become a Lakers fan. So
you gotta get somebody on the come up, like the Kings. I know they didn't play well last night, but they're playing really well right now. But how do you? You're in this business for a living, is trying to drive content. How do you consume yours? Do you go to social media first? Do you go to the websites first? How does that work for you?
I guess it depends kind of on what I'm looking for, but casually, I'm gonna be on Twitter, and that's where I find a lot of my information or just fun things about sports. Twitter, Instagram. Instagram's a little bit more difficult because that kind of mixes in with personal stuff as well. But I do follow all of the main accounts on Instagram too, and they're posting stuff. But with their new algorithm, it kind of makes it a little bit less live time. So Twitter is great for keeping up with sports, especially during games. And you want to know what's going on. I think it's programmed into a lot of, especially young people's brains, to go to Twitter first, too, because they know that, especially if you're following a ton of people, like I follow a ton of sports media people, that someone's going to be talking about it.
Yeah.
Or you can do a quick little search and somebody else is going to be talking about it if you don't even follow them. So I do a lot of Twitter. But I also do, if I want to get more in depth on stuff, I'll go and read the articles, go to ESPN.com,
Of course.
Dig a little bit deeper into it. But if you want that quick thing, it's hard to beat Twitter.
Yeah, I completely agree. You can follow me on Twitter at ChildressMark. You can follow Kaila at K_Burns-Heffner if you want to follow her as well. Looks like we've reached Lawton Swan from Clemson Sports Talk. Always one of my favorite guys to have on here and talk Clemson. Lawton, man, what's going on? A big win for the Clemson basketball team this week for sure.
Well, look, it definitely puts them in a different position than where they would have been with a loss there, with upcoming matchups next week with Florida State and NC State looming. I kind of looked at it and I was like, man, if they don't find a way to scratch one out here against Georgia Tech, they may start off 0-6 in conference play. Now they kind of put themselves in a position, and again, and I didn't want to, don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater that early in the season, but because one loss was to Duke, one loss was to Virginia, two teams that are ranked number one right now, one in the AP and one in the coaches poll that are squaring off this weekend. But it just looked like, hey, if you don't beat Georgia Tech, momentum, confidence, and everything was really going to be tough to overcome over the next couple of games. And now they've got a chance where if you can beat a couple of really good teams in Florida State and NC State, win a couple of road games at conference, the complexion of the season changes immensely.
I think people look at Clemson going 0-3 in conference play and they're like, oh, well, last year, they started off with 3 straight wins. But when you look at it's Duke, Syracuse, and Virginia that they lost to, and then now finally getting this first ACC win over Georgia Tech. Those are good opponents that they were playing. That's a tough stretch of games to play. So what does this team have to do now that they do have that first win under their belt? What do they have to do to continue to win in the ACC?
Well, I think obviously when you talk about the job that Marquise Reed did, scoring 30 points and the way he does it, that's going to be important because as Reed goes, it would seem the team kind of goes right now. And it was good to see him in what appeared to be 100% against Georgia Tech. Now, the problem that I think they'll have maybe coming up on Tuesday when they take on Florida State is simply that length that Florida State has. Leonard Hamilton does an incredible job of getting long, athletic guards, and that's going to be, I think, maybe for Clemson, the biggest struggle that they have moving forward. But that's something you should be used to by this point. I mean, these two guys have been in this league for a while now with Marquise Reed and Shelton Mitchell. They know that they're not always the biggest guys on the court, but they've just got to perform at a high level in order for this team to be successful, because length and athleticism on the perimeter in the ACC is as good as maybe any league in the country, if not the best. And so I think that's going to be the big thing, just making sure that Marquise Reed and Mitchell and those guys at the guard spots stay confident, because that's really the key. If they get down on themselves, the season can become a long, long struggle for the Tigers.
I know people are especially Clemson fans, are probably still on that high of the Alabama beatdown, but what do you expect that people can look for in this upcoming 2019 season?
You don't want to be they're going to go 15-0 and win another national title. That's a little bit out on the limb there. But, seeing the schedule released earlier this week, I'll be honest, I think the toughest stretch is the opening 3 games. And then I really believe with the 2 bye weeks, everything sets up really well for Clemson. I think they've got a tremendous chance to finish the regular season 12-0 again. And I don't think that's thinking too much about who they are. I just think that by comparison to their contemporaries in the ACC, if you tell me they're going to get past Texas A&M, Florida State's got talent. Again, you're going to be playing them in Death Valley. You're playing A&M in Death Valley. It's tough to find a loss right now in the regular season. Who comes over from the Coastal Division? I don't know. The past 6 years, it's been six different teams. So I guess Virginia's on the clock. This will be their year to get there and take on the Tigers. But nonetheless, I really think you got a real good chance to go undefeated into the ACC championship game, just eyeballing the schedule.
Kaila, I've been wanting to talk to you about this during the show here. I'll give you a couple of stats that I pulled from Twitter. This from Alicia Jessup. Clemson, revenue from the athletic department for the last year, $51.7 million, expenses $43.9 million. That's pretty good.
Gosh.
Making a little money.
Making some money.
Alabama, revenue last season, $108 million, expenses $62 million.
Wow.
So you can see there's still a big gap.
There's a big gap there.
And the ACC network's going to help fill some of that. But the SEC, especially Alabama, just continues to pack the coffers with cash. Also, this from Mark J. Burns, and it's at Mark J. Burns 88. This is one of my favorite guys to follow. He's like a sports business guy. When sports and college football is the front door of your university, applications to Clemson University have surged since 2008. In 2008, there were 15,500 freshman applicants. Last year, 28,844 students applied. Just a little change in the last 10 years. So how have you seen things change? Because you graduated in 2016.
2017.
2017,
So
good grief.
My senior year was the year that Clemson won the championship for the first time in a while.
Yep.
So I got to see, I wasn't there the immediate year following to that, but I've been back a few times since I've been down to Charlotte, just see, what is going on with the university since Clemson's been having this success. But I mean, of course, they were having success in the time frame where I was there, which was definitely bumping up the number of applicants. And I mean, even when I was there, they started building all of these new apartment complexes in downtown Clemson just because the surge of people that were coming in and having interest in Clemson, it was, incredible. I mean, now you look at Clemson and there's, before you would see the little strip of downtown, your bars and your clothing shops and everything. And now there's 4 apartment complexes that are there. When I was there, they were just building one. And then the final year, my senior year, they were starting to build, a couple more. And they just keep going from there.
And a lot of new athletic facilities as well. Mm-hmm. So, kudos to Clemson. I mean, their times are good, and they're taking advantage of that and taking their world-class facilities and growing them out even larger. There's a softball stadium going in. I think there's a new tennis complex open this year. Everywhere you look, the money's being spent because it's there, and I think that's a good thing. So I also pulled this from Twitter. These are senior class numbers for the football team, right? We all know they were 55-4. And, again, these numbers are tough to get your head around. So the Clemson seniors that just left, they were 27-1 at home. The offense scored more than 50 points 12 times, more than 40 points 25 times, which is amazing. The defense held teams to 10 or less points 24 times. That's 40% of the games the seniors played in, 10 or less points given up by the defense. 20-point wins, 31 out of the 59 games. So almost 53% of the games that the seniors played in at Clemson, they won by 20 or more points. Obviously, they never lost by more than 20 points. Average game score during this time frame, 39 and 17. 20-plus point playoff wins, 4. Is that not unbelievable?
That's insane.
It really is. And then the average playoff game score, 33 and 19. The bar has been set so high, Kaila. And I've said this a couple of times this week. Where is the peak of the mountain for this Clemson team? And as the game was ending on Monday, a week ago, I was like, man, I would have thought the peak of the mountain was a 28-point blowout over Alabama in the national championship game. But I started thinking about the team over the next couple seasons, and it could get even better, and that's crazy.
So I spent 3 years covering Clemson, and it felt like every single year the next class was like, oh, well, this is the new winningest class or senior class in Clemson history. And then the same year, the next year was the same exact thing.
Yeah.
And then this year, they finally get to the point where now they're the first 15-0 college football team in the modern era. So, like, how do you get better than that? I mean, you can put more points on the board and shut out your opponents more. But from, like, a level of, how can you continue to get better? I mean, we've seen them continue to get better every single year and continue to have more accolades and just adding on more awards into the book. But like when you get to that point, how much farther can you go? Unless, of course, they, extend the playoffs and, all that jazz. Yeah. And there's more games or so. But that's what we're looking at right now.
It's absolutely incredible. And the numbers are astronomical when you look at them. So, again, a 5-2 record in the playoffs, 30-2 in the ACC. They lost 2 ACC games in 4 years. Of course, the game against Syracuse where Kelly Bryant got hurt, and that weird one against Pittsburgh where I think, I want to say it was almost 600 yards that Deshaun threw for in that game. So
fun guy named James Conner they were going against in that game.
Yeah, no doubt. That Pittsburgh team was loaded and did some great job coaching that day. So, Kaila, it's been a great show today. We had Richmond Weaver in for the first hour with us. James Trapp, former Clemson football player, world-class sprinter, was the alternate on the Olympic team, had a long NFL career, talked about winning the Super Bowl with the Baltimore Ravens over the New York Giants. You can catch that in hour 1 of the podcast if you want to go online and check that out. Hour number 2 of the show started off with Don Munson. Some great things to say about the Clemson basketball team and football team. Black Jack Fletcher, analyst for the Action Network. He says, get on the Saints, -3, get on the Chiefs, -3, and take the over in both games. And this guy does this for a living, folks. Might want to listen to him. Marcel Louis-Jacques from the Charlotte Observer. Panthers' needs in the upcoming draft. Offensive linemen, pass rush, and secondary. And he even said the Panthers with the 16 pick, he kind of liked Oklahoma offensive tackle Cody Ford. He thought that might be the type of player that the Panthers might be focused on, is go into the draft, focused on the offensive line, and then maybe build up the pass rush and the secondary through free agency and focus on that. Lawton Swan from Clemson Sports Talk on board. Always a fun time to talk to him as well. So you can go back hour number 1, 2, and 3 of the podcast and pick up those things if you missed it. Coming up next for us here, Swamp Rabbits Hockey hosting the Atlanta Gladiators. Kaila, you drove all the way down for Charlotte to join us for this show today. I hope you had fun, and I really enjoyed having you.
I had a great time. Always have a great time on the show, so thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was great, and you're always welcome anytime to come back down.